This isn't a trade dispute, it's a leverage test. On Saturday, President Donald Trump posted a message that stunned European capitals and quietly rattled markets. 8 NATO allies were told their goods would face rising U.S. tariffs unless Greenland is sold to the United States. That contradiction is the story. These are military partners, not adversaries, and yet the threat lands directly on prices, supply chains, and alliances that affect you, not diplomats in a room somewhere. Here is what we know from the announcement itself. Trump named Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Finland. Tariffs start at 10% on February 1st. They rise to 25% on June 1st. He wrote that this continues until such time as a deal is reached for the complete and total purchase of Greenland. He also claimed these countries had journeyed to Greenland for purposes unknown, calling it a very dangerous situation. Now here's where the tension forms. Greenland isn't for sale. Denmark has said that flatly. NATO allies say troop movements were transparent and defensive, and yet the economic threat isn't symbolic. Tariffs already average around 15% on EU goods and 10% on UK imports. In metals and autos, stacked measures already sit in the mid-teens to mid-20s. This stacks on top. What that implies is bigger than Greenland. This isn't about a frozen island. It's about whether economic pressure can succeed where diplomacy and even military hints failed. And in a moment, you'll see why this puts the entire US-EU trade framework on a countdown clock. Here's how this gets framed before the full picture is even visible. The administration isn't presenting this as a trade fight. It's presenting it as a response. In Trump's own words, the tariffs are tied to what he described as European nations moving troops to Greenland. He didn't cite evidence, he didn't name dates or units. He called the purpose unknown and labeled it a planetary security risk. But notice what's actually happening beneath that framing. Greenland is Danish territory, Denmark is in NATO, so are the 7 other countries named. That means this isn't one country being pressured. It's a coordinated economic action aimed at an alliance bloc, and because the European Union is a single customs union, tariffs on one member effectively spill across all 27. That's why this instantly threatens the EU-US trade agreement reached just last August. Manfred Weber, a senior member of the European Parliament, said approval of the deal is not possible at this stage. He explicitly linked that pause to Trump's Greenland threats. An emergency meeting of EU ambassadors was called for Sunday afternoon. That speed matters. So here's the reframing question. If tariffs can be triggered by territorial demands against an ally, are trade deals still rules-based, or are they now conditional leverage tools? Because the answer to that determines whether this is an episode or a template. And the first proof that this isn't isolated comes straight from Trump himself. The strongest clue comes from how openly this tactic is being described. A day before the tariff announcement, Trump told reporters at the White House that he may put a tariff on countries if they don't go along with Greenland, adding, because we need Greenland for national security. That statement matters because it removes ambiguity. This wasn't a reactive measure. It was a preview. Then the policy landed exactly as promised. 10% tariffs starting February 1st, 25% by June 1st, no negotiations announced, no multilateral talks, just a deadline and an outcome. That's the claim in action. Tariffs as coercion, not correction. Now notice what's missing. There's no citation of a specific legal violation by Europe, no breach of treaty, no finding of unfair trade practices tied to Greenland. The justification isn't economic, it's strategic. And that distinction matters because it changes how far this power can reach. This is where the story flips, because the legal tool Trump appears to be leaning on isn't a trade statute at all. It's emergency authority, and that opens a door that may already be closing. What's escalating now isn't just pressure on Europe. It's pressure on the system that's supposed to limit how this pressure is used. Trump didn't cite a statute in his post, but the move mirrors his earlier use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. That law allows sweeping economic action during what the president defines as an unusual and extraordinary threat. That's the normalization moment. Tariffs justified not by trade imbalance, but by territorial ambition and security language. Historically, emergency powers were used for sanctions against adversaries. Here they're aimed at allies. That shift matters. And it's happening while the Supreme Court is already weighing whether to strike down earlier tariffs imposed under that same authority. The court could rule as soon as next week. If it does, this entire new tranche could be imperiled immediately. In effect, the announcement dares the judiciary to intervene mid-escalation. This is no longer just a negotiation tactic. It's a test of boundaries, legal, economic, and political, all at once. And Europe understood that instantly, because their response wasn't gradual. It was coordinated. The second proof hit came from the reaction itself. Not anger alone, but alignment. Across Europe, leaders treated the announcement as more than trade pressure. Ursula von der Leyen, who controls EU trade policy, didn't talk about tariffs first. She talked about values. We choose partnership and cooperation, she wrote. We choose our businesses. We choose our people. That's a rejection of the premise, not just the penalty. Then the contradiction sharpened. Denmark's Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen said the move came as a surprise, especially after what she described as a constructive meeting with U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio. She directly disputed Trump's claim about troop movements, saying the increased presence was purely to enhance security in an Arctic region that is no longer a low-tension area, and that it was done transparently with allies. Here's why that changes how you see this. If the troop justification doesn't hold, then the tariffs aren't reactive. They're instrumental. French President Emmanuel Macron said flatly that no intimidation nor threat will influence us. Sweden's Prime Minister used the word blackmailed. This isn't disagreement. It's a line being drawn, and once that line is drawn, escalation stops being theoretical. Then the pressure started stacking fast. First, EU ambassadors were called into an emergency session triggered by Cyprus, the bloc's rotating presidency. That doesn't happen for routine disputes. Second, European Council President Antonio Costa confirmed the EU was already coordinating a joint response, signaling this wouldn't be handled country by country. Third, the warning shifted outward. The EU's foreign policy chief Kaja Kallas said the tariffs were exactly what China and Russia want, writing that they benefit from divisions among allies. Now watch how quickly the frame widens. What began as tariffs tied to Greenland turns into alliance cohesion, then into great power competition. At the same time, some European economists urged restraint. One called the tariffs a step forward compared to the threatened military invasion. That line matters. It tells you how compressed the situation feels on the ground. So, here's the pressure question that hangs in the air. If economic threats replace military ones, but still destabilize alliances, what happens if this continues? Here's where this stops being abstract and starts landing on you. Tariffs don't sit on balance sheets. They move through supply chains and show up in prices. Lawmakers in Washington said that out loud. Senators from both parties warned that threatening NATO with tariffs would raise costs for U.S. families while helping rivals like China and Russia. That's not ideology, that's math. If you buy a car with European parts, metals sourced from the EU, or products assembled through transatlantic supply chains, stacked tariffs matter. Lawmakers said these measures would raise prices for both families and businesses at a time when many Americans are already worried about the cost of living. That's the lived consequence. And notice this detail. A bipartisan U.S. delegation was in Copenhagen at the same time, trying to restore a sense of trust. One senator said there are no pressing security threats to Greenland. Another praised European deployments as allies stepping up. Two realities colliding in real time. If this feels familiar, say so in the comments, because what looks like foreign policy up top often becomes household pressure down here. The deeper insight sits underneath all of this noise. This works because leverage travels faster than law. Tariffs can be announced in a post. Markets react immediately. Allies are forced to respond in hours, not months. Treaties, courts, and alliances move slower by design. That creates an imbalance. One side can generate pressure instantly, the other has to absorb it through process. That's why Scott Lincicome warned that this exposes the fragility of unilateral deals. He said Trump's announcement confirms that trade agreements can be changed on a whim and don't constrain daily tariff impulses. That's not an insult, it's a structural observation. The unsettling part is this: when executive power isn't bounded tightly, uncertainty becomes the tool, and uncertainty is contagious. It freezes investment, hardens alliances, and rewards actors who thrive on disruption. That's how systems bend, without formally breaking. And once that dynamic sets in, the next move is rarely announced in advance. From here, the trajectory splits, and neither path is clean. One path runs through the courts. If the Supreme Court strikes down the earlier emergency tariffs, this new threat could collapse almost immediately. That would force a reset, not just on Greenland, but on how far emergency economic powers can go. It would slow everything down. The other path moves faster. Europe prepares countermeasures, trade talks freeze, tariffs begin stacking in June, alliance trust erodes quietly, while coordination shifts toward containment rather than cooperation. None of that requires headlines to escalate. It just requires momentum. What makes this moment unstable is that both paths can exist at the same time. Legal uncertainty on one track, economic retaliation on the other, and sitting in between is Greenland, still not for sale, while pressure continues to build. The next move isn't theoretical, it's already forming. Here's the line that reframes everything. This wasn't about buying land. It was about testing how much pressure an alliance can absorb before it changes behavior. Every fact in this story points to that. Tariffs tied to a territorial demand, allies responding in unison, courts being dared to intervene, prices potentially rising at home, while rivals watch from the sidelines. When you zoom out, Greenland becomes the trigger, not the target. The unresolved question is whether leverage replaces trust as the default tool of power. If it does, this won't be the last time economic threats are used where diplomacy used to live. That's why this matters beyond one post, one deadline, or one island. If you want to follow how this unfolds and what it signals before it shows up in your life, subscribe for continued analysis.